We are building the Minesweeper project from the YByte Python curriculum available at www.ybyte.in. Previously, we wrote this function to find neighbors. Basically, the idea is that we are looking at every square as being a center square. Now we will see how do we handle the case of, let's say, the edge squares or the corner squares. The best way to sort of understand this would be to just implement this function. Let's say run this function for a edge square or a corner square. Let's say I run this for a square given by, let's say I say n is, say, find neighbors for example 2 and let's say 8. Now when I do this, expectedly my n becomes, let's say, all the rows and columns, assuming that 2 8 was a center square. Now clearly I end up with things which are beyond this board, because for example I get something on the ninth column, there ain't no ninth column. So all of these items are in fact not correct. So basically what happened was I asked it to find neighbors from 2 8. It assumed 2 8 to be a center square, and hence it has given me squares which are not valid. For example, here I've got a 9. Now let's take one more example. Let's take I try a corner square. This is going to be 8 0. So if I were to do, let's say, n find neighbors, say 8 0. Again, the approach is to think of this as a center square. So it thought of the 8 squares that are possibly around this. Once again, the pattern, once again, we see that there are squares which are not valid. For example, 7 minus 1, 8 minus 1, and everything, for instance, on the so-called ninth row, which doesn't exist. But given that we are seeing this, in fact, this also tells us a solution, like we discussed earlier. In fact, all we need to do is to prune out those squares which are not a part of the board. And how do we find that out? Well, any time that the row index or the column index becomes, let's say, more than 8 or less than 0. In general, more than n calls and n rows, and let's say less than 0. So all I need to do is to remove those, let's say tuples from the list of neighbors. Now we can do this by just updating our function find neighbors. Remember, we are creating tempc and tempr, two lists. I can filter out these lists in the sense that whatever value of this column or row index, let's say, has become either less than 0 or more than, for example, n calls in case of tempc, or more than n rows in case of let's say tempr. Now in fact that's all I need to do, because everything else will take care from the for loop. Let's implement this and understand how this thing is actually working. So I come back here to my code. Now remember, all I need to do is to filter out some values from, let's say, tempc and tempr, which are not valid values. I can do that by using list comprehension. I can go and say tempc is equal to x for x in, let's say, tempc, where two conditions are met. I can say, well, if x is so x is greater than -1 and x is less than n calls. In fact, that's all we need. This will ensure that all the tempc values that we are looking at are between 0 and n calls -1. Similarly, I can do the same thing for tempr. Just have to be careful while copying and pasting. This has to be rows. This has to be tempr, and also this has to be tempr. So x for x in tempr, if x is greater than -1 and x is less than n rows, and beyond that everything remains exactly the same. Now when I run my code, let's say, to find neighbors on 2 8, I find that my nn has, if I were to look at length of nn, that has only 5 items, and you notice that these are valid neighbors because there's no column 9. Likewise, if I were to do nn is, let's say, find neighbors, it's like, for example, 8 say 0, that's a corner square. If I were to look at nn, clearly that is only 3 items, 7 0, 7 1 and 8 1, and all of this basically makes perfect sense. This approach that we have followed is quite interesting because it has kept the code neat and clean, quite easy to understand, without creating too many if conditions to handle all, let's say, the different exceptions that we have to handle. In fact, the find neighbor function that we have just written is a very, very important part of this program. We will see the uses later as well. I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope you like this approach of building activities to learn Python programming, because I think this is a really powerful approach. Look at our website www.yby.in, because we learn Python programming through such fun activities. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.